Everyone, welcome to today's explainer. Look, if you've ever felt completely exhausted, confused, or just totally drained by one specific relationship in your life, well, you're absolutely in the right place. Today, we're taking all the emotion out of it and we're stepping into the role of the objective observer. Think of this as an active session where I get to guide you, kind of like I recently guided a client of mine, let's call him Alex, toward reclaiming your agency. We're going to build a highly practical toolkit for maintaining boundaries, and we're grounding it not in frustration, but in hard clinical psychology and neuroscience.
So I want you to really ask yourself this. Are you absorbing someone else's chaos? It's incredibly easy to get caught up in a dynamic where you feel targeted, totally exhausted, and basically victimized by somebody else's unpredictable behavior. Honestly, that's exactly where Alex was at the start of our work together. But we're going to shift that focus right now. We are moving away from feeling like a victim and stepping into a highly empowered state of objective self-preservation. Because the very first step to protecting your peace is realizing that the chaos doesn't actually belong to you. To navigate this effectively, we really have to bypass any moral condemnation. We need to look at pathological narcissism through a strictly clinical lens. By definition, this is not an excess of self-love. Far from it, actually. It's a profound developmental deficit in self-regulation, and it's very often rooted in early developmental trauma or conditional attachment. Understanding this is exactly what helped Alex finally stop taking things personally. It's a structural deficit. It is absolutely not a calculated attack on your worth.
All right, here is your structured treatment plan to safely exit these chaotic dynamics. We'll map out the psychological blueprint, then look at grandiose versus covert types, take a peek inside the narcissistic brain, and finally build emotional firewalls and real-world boundary scripts. Let's get right to work. Okay, part 1, the psychological blueprint, looking at the fragile true self versus the grandiose false persona. To understand the behavior, we first have to examine this blueprint. At the very core of the narcissistic structure is a deeply fractured, shame-ridden, and really fragile true self. And because this core is just so vulnerable, the individual constructs a rigid, compensatory defense mechanism. They build this grandiose false persona, a mask really, characterized by omnipotence, perfection, and entitlement that is entirely designed to protect the fragile reality underneath. Now, because this false persona lacks any genuine internal infrastructure, it can't generate its own self-esteem. It operates exactly like a leaking battery. Seriously, it requires a continuous, non-stop stream of external validation, admiration, attention, or even fear and submission from others just to maintain equilibrium. In clinical terms, we call this external validation narcissistic supply. They literally cannot function without it.
And this desperate need for supply is what drives the interpersonal erosion cycle. Relationships with these individuals almost always follow a highly predictable 3-phase sequence. Step 1 is idealization. You're put on a pedestal because associating with your perceived perfection serves their ego. But, as we know, human perfection is completely unsustainable. So step 2 is devaluation. When you show human flaws, or say assert a boundary, it threatens their fragile illusion and they pivot to hypercriticism. Finally, step 3 is discard. When you're emotionally exhausted and can no longer provide high-quality supply, you're abruptly cast aside. Recognizing this exact pattern is what finally helped my client Alex realize that the behavior is a systemic cycle. It is not a personalized reflection of his value.
Moving on to section 2, grandiose versus vulnerable types, and how to identify the phenotypes. You see, narcissism doesn't always look like loud, cinematic arrogance, which is why identifying the specific phenotype is absolutely crucial. Let's look at a case study comparing two distinct expressions from Alex's life. At work, Alex has a grandiose boss. This phenotype is overtly arrogant, demands direct adulation, and acts aggressively entitled. But at home, Alex deals with a vulnerable or covert partner. Now, this phenotype presents as introverted and hypervigilant, hiding behind a super thin-skinned facade of humility. Instead of demanding adulation, they seek supply through a martyr narrative. They're always the unappreciated genius or the person suffering the absolute most. Their underlying tactic isn't overt aggression, it's deep resentment, weaponizing guilt, and using the silent treatment. Identifying exactly which phenotype you're dealing with dictates exactly how you defend yourself.
All right, part 3, inside the narcissistic brain, looking through the neuroscientific lens. This is where things get truly fascinating, because social cognitive neuroscience reveals that this behavior is heavily driven by distinct structural and functional alterations in the brain. Understanding this is what finally removes the emotional weight for good.
And this brilliantly illustrates the core neurological reality, which comes down to cognitive empathy versus affective empathy. Narcissistic individuals have totally intact cognitive empathy. That means they have the intellectual capacity to map out and understand exactly what you're thinking, which, by the way, is precisely why they can be so manipulative. However, neuroimaging shows structural abnormalities, specifically reduced gray matter in the anterior insula and anterior cingulate cortex. They have a massive deficit in affective empathy. Neurologically speaking, they simply cannot viscerally feel your emotional pain. They just can't.
This neurological makeup creates some severe structural limitations. First off, there's an introspection deficit. The prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for objective self-reflection, basically fails to down-regulate defensiveness, meaning it's neurologically almost impossible for them to experience genuine accountability. On top of that, there's threat perception hyperreactivity. Their amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, treats a minor critique or a tiny ego threat as a literal existential threat to survival. This causes an immediate amygdala hijack, resulting in instant, survival-driven rage or profound withdrawal. It's biology reacting, not logic.
Okay, Section 4, Building Emotional Firewalls. We're looking at emotional intelligence and self-preservation strategies. Now that we have the clinical diagnosis, we're shifting to the prescription. We are moving you from emotional reactivity right into high EQ self-preservation. Your goal is no longer to change them, your goal is to protect your own cognitive bandwidth.
First up in your toolkit is the gray rock method. When my clients practice this, they intentionally become as uninteresting, unyielding, and emotionally non-responsive as a literal gray rock. You interact only using flat, boring, factual statements. By doing this, you actively deny them the emotional reactivity, the anger, the tears, the defensiveness that they so desperately crave as narcissistic supply. When you become a dry well for drama, their leaking battery forces them to look elsewhere.
Next, we have to totally shift how we handle boundaries. Standard boundaries are communicative agreements, right? But narcissistic boundaries must be non-negotiable, unilateral actions. Do not attempt to negotiate, because they view negotiation as an open invitation to argue. Instead, use a strict formula. If you do action X, I will neutrally execute response Y. No waiting for permission, no seeking an apology, you just simply execute your response.
You also absolutely must build a cognitive firewall to interrupt something called projective identification. This is when they unconsciously dump their own incompetence, anxiety, and toxic shame onto you, hoping you'll act it out. So when you feel a sudden surge of anxiety during an interaction, just pause and ask yourself, is this anxiety genuinely mine, or am I absorbing their internal chaos? Explicitly label it. Tell yourself, this frantic energy belongs to them, not me, and halt that emotional osmosis immediately.
And all of this leads us to the ultimate turning point for your recovery: radical acceptance. This is the profound acknowledgement of reality exactly as it is. It means entirely relinquishing the hope that they're eventually going to see the light, offer a sincere apology, or magically change their neurobiology. Accepting their wiring as fixed stops you from wasting precious emotional currency on a dry well, and it allows you to make strategic decisions based on reality.
All right, final section, real-world boundary scripts. Let's do some field exercises for work and home. We're going to take all of this neuroscience and apply it to real-world boundary scripts for exactly where you might find yourself cornered.
Scenario 1, a professional setting dealing with credit theft or blame. So imagine Alex's grandiose manager publicly takes credit for a project. The instinct here is to fall right into the ego trap, interrupting emotionally and launching a public accusation. But as we know, this triggers their amygdala, provokes a public counterattack, and just makes you look defensive to leadership. Instead, you use the objective pivot. You model calm execution, slow down, let them finish, and anchor the conversation completely back to objective facts and metrics.
Here is your exact script for that objective pivot. In the meeting, you say, I am glad we are highlighting the excellent trajectory of this project. To build directly on that framework, as I was authoring the core code and executing the deployment phase last week, I built in specific metrics that I would love to walk the team through right now. Notice what you did there? You didn't accuse. You simply secured your footprint through execution, protecting your reputation without directly triggering a narcissistic rage response.
Scenario 2, a personal setting dealing with gaslighting or guilt trips. Now, Alex's covert partner uses gaslighting to claim they never said something, or maybe launches a guilt trip. So the crucial point here is avoiding the JADE trap. Do not justify, argue, defend, or explain. Doing so signals that reality is up for debate, which just feeds their supply. Instead, you drop a boundary anchor. You completely refuse to debate reality or absorb their passive-aggressive guilt.
Here is exactly how you execute the boundary anchor. Speak with a flat, monotone voice. It is surprisingly effective, almost like a clinical magic trick, how quickly this diffuses the drama. You say, "We remember the timeline differently, and I am not going to argue about it. I hear that you are feeling unsupported right now, but I am keeping my commitment to attend this seminar tonight." Boom. You acknowledge the emotion, but you hold a completely firm line on your reality and your unilateral action.
Which brings us to our final thought today. You now have the clinical framework, just like my clients do. You understand the structural deficits in their brain, the crucial difference between cognitive and affective empathy, and the predictable cycles of their behavior. You're fully armed with the gray rock method and non-negotiable boundary scripts. So I have to ask you, now that you understand the neurological wiring behind the manipulation, what will you choose to accept today to protect your peace tomorrow? The chaos belongs to them. The agency entirely belongs to you.